For those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast, and I've been teaching the LSAT for about 15 years now. And I'm very excited to be joined by Jonathan Glick, Director of Admissions at Maryland Carey Law. How you doing, Jonathan?
I'm great, thanks. How are you doing this evening?
I'm great. Thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate your taking the time. So there have been a lot of questions this year with the digital LSAT, specifically how things like cancellations and retakes will look to admission officers, given that there have been some tech issues with the rollout of the digital LSAT, and a lot of folks didn't really know what to expect going into it. So what are you telling applicants who ask you about this sort of question?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I know it's been an issue for some students recently in particular. The first thing I would say is if you're not satisfied with your LSAT score, the number one rule is that you should definitely retake it. So regardless of kind of the reason, I definitely recommend retaking it if you felt like there was something that first time when you took it that kind of threw you for a loop or just made it so that you didn't necessarily get the score that you were achieving on your practice test or that you felt like you were capable of. So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing regarding cancellations, regarding, lower LSAT scores than an individual may want, I definitely do think it can be advantageous to write an addendum. It's one of those factors, though, where you're going to have to think about how you do on future LSATs. If you do take it again, how you did on a past LSAT, obviously you're not going to want to write an addendum if you have a 154 and then a 155.
Right. No, thanks for that. I think students often stress a little bit too much about writing an addendum when the answer so often is simply retake. Yep. I mean, there's no substitute for the score at the end of the day, right?
Yep. And, we are understanding of those issues. And if there was something that made your experience particularly difficult, or if you did have to, cancel, you can certainly write an addendum. Now, that being said, if you have one cancellation on an LSAT, that's not necessarily something you need to write an addendum for. Now, if you have 3 or 4 and it starts to become more of a pattern, that's where, you definitely want to consider writing an addendum explaining what those circumstances were.
Right. So thank you for clarifying that. So one cancellation, no big deal, not even worth writing about it or drawing attention to it or bringing it up. But that pattern of 3 or 4 or more cancellations or absences starts to look kind of flaky, I would imagine.
Exactly. And, even more specifically to this cycle, there were a significant number of students who were registered for the November LSAT and who just took it. We've heard from a significant number of students who do plan to take the LSAT in January. I think this year, particularly with the changes in the LSAT, going from being offered 4 times a year to 6 times a year to now 9 times a year, I do expect some more applications to come in a little bit later than maybe they have in years past, just because there's more opportunities to take the LSAT now. And with the transition to digital, particularly, with the July LSAT, the ability to cancel that score, I think there are going to be more applications coming in with January scores this year.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of application timing, because it's a big question for applicants. Is January too late? Is the February LSAT too late? What about March? They're nearly every month now. And so I'm wondering, there obviously are some drawbacks to applying later, right? Like maybe less scholarship money available or slightly lower odds. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for us at Maryland Carey Law, our priority deadline is April 1st, meaning, we encourage students to get their application in for, priority consideration for admission and for scholarships, before April 1st. That being said, the application is open, basically through the end of July. Now, obviously, the later that you get in the admissions cycle, it can become a little bit more difficult to gain admission and to gain a scholarship. And, there's a couple reasons for that. One is, the later that you get at that point, people have accepted scholarships. They've paid seat deposits. They've kind of reserved their spots, and there's just less spots that are available. There's people every year who apply, in April, May, and June, who unfortunately don't get in, and maybe the result would have been different had they applied in September, October, November, December. So that's one thing to consider. Now, that being said, taking the January LSAT this year, I think for us is completely fine. Taking the February should be fine. Once you start to get to March or later, at that point, by the time you get your score, you're in April already, and it can become a little bit more difficult on that end to gain admission. So, it's one of those things too, where the later that you apply, the applicant pool is kind of, the applicant pool is bigger really. And so at that point, you are being compared a little bit more to other applicants than, when you're applying really early and there's just not a massive applicant pool at that point in time, there's less of that comparison, I would say.
Right. Now, Maryland Carey Law, that's a relatively later deadline than some of the other schools. Wouldn't you say? You said April 1st deadline for priority consideration, yep, which is only 5 months or less until classes actually start.
Yep.
So would you say you're a little bit later than average, and some other schools are typically more looking for like the January LSAT to be the last one or the February LSAT to be the last one?
Absolutely. I do think we're a little bit later than average. I think a lot of schools are, kind of in that early March range in terms of, you want to get your application in. And honestly, it's not really that different at Maryland. I definitely, just because our priority deadline is April 1st, I wouldn't encourage people to wait until, March 25th to submit their application. It's still feasible, obviously, to get in at that point. But there is an advantage to applying a little bit earlier. And ideally, if you can, I would always recommend trying to get that application in by the end of February or so.
And if they're submitted in January or February, you practice, of course, rolling admissions, right? So you're evaluating them as you receive them.
Yep, absolutely. We are evaluating them as they come in. We have made some decisions already this year. We expect additional decisions to kind of keep rolling out over the next several months.
And when do applications open? They open back in September?
Yep, September 1st.
Nice. Okay, awesome. So I'm hoping we could dive a little bit into some of the different parts of the application and walk through best practices for each part.
Yeah, absolutely.
So of course, first and foremost is the personal statement. And that's a big topic right now, since many folks are frantically writing theirs and working on theirs. And I've been helping a lot of my students work through them from brainstorming to final draft. And I'm wondering if you could walk through some examples, if any come to mind, with details anonymized, of course, of what a stellar one might look like and what a terrible one might look like, if anything comes to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the one thing I always caution applicants is there's no such thing as a perfect personal statement. You should never go into writing that personal statement trying to tell admissions officers what you think that we want you to say. That's generally not the way to go about it. At the end of the day, I think it's best to think of the personal statement as an interview, and think about it as if, you and I are sitting across from each other and I said, here's 5 minutes. Tell me about yourself. Tell me about why you want to go to law school, and kind of answer those questions as to why law is your career goal. And I think that's really a good guideline in terms of getting that personal statement off the ground and starting it. A lot of times the hardest part is getting it started. And then the second hardest part sometimes is paring it down. As far as examples of ones that I really enjoyed or ones that, I kind of would recommend not doing. So for ones that I really liked, I read a personal statement a couple of years back from a student who volunteered in Haiti after there were earthquakes there. And her personal statement told a story basically of how she got off the plane, how there was, not electricity. It was dark everywhere. The infrastructure wasn't in place. And, she related that experience to her desire to work for the government, to get into dealing with emergency preparedness law. And so it flowed seamlessly. It told a story. It talked about her interests and experience that she had that led her to want to go to law school. And I think that was a really strong personal statement because it was a story. It did draw, it drew me in. I wanted to know, where is this person going with this essay? So I think that's a really good example of one. As far as, don'ts for the personal statement, I think sometimes people recite their resume and just kind of write it out in prose form, which doesn't really tell me anything about you that I can't already see on that resume. So that's one of the things that I don't necessarily love. The personal statements that say I'm a really hard worker, or, I'm really disciplined, or I have great public speaking skills, or I've wanted to, be an attorney since I was 2 years old, or I want to be an attorney because I love arguing. Those kind of cliches, or those, those statements where you're telling me something instead of showing me, I think those personal statements tend to not be quite as good. We can deduce that you're a hard worker from an example that you provide. That's not something explicitly that you should feel like you need to say.
Thanks for breaking that down. So what I heard there was the statement about Haiti. It really hooked you from the beginning. It's in the moment, giving lots of details. You're really picturing this applicant in that situation, and it's a story. So you're hooked and you want to see where it's going. But in contrast, the laundry list of the resume, which is a classic folly that I see from a lot of applicants, people just tell the chronology of their entire life story from beginning up to the present moment. And as you said, that's really just filling in all the little filler words to turn your resume into a paragraph. But there's no story there.
Exactly. We want to learn about the applicants. And that's kind of the biggest thing that, the applicants should keep in mind when they're drafting that personal statement is we want to learn about who you are. We want to learn about why you want to go to law school. And you want to write something that kind of flows and melds that together. And look, personal statement prompts are going to be different for each school as well. So I always recommend making sure that you're following prompts if there is one.
Right. And do you feel like the personal statement should always say in some way why that applicant wants to go to law school?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it really depends on, what that prompt is and what the school is looking for. But I do think it's helpful. Part of our prompt is why do you want to go to law school? Why are you interested in Maryland? Those are kind of parts of the prompt that we ask for. And so for us, yes. But more generally, I think when students really sit down and think about why they want to go to law school, usually it's related to an experience they had or a class they took or a professor or, it could be a current event, something in their background. There's usually kind of a story there that you can kind of weave parts together and really give us that clear idea as to, who you are and why you want to go to law school.
I like the idea of that because so many applicants where they haven't done anything super impressive, like not everyone's gone to Haiti, presumably to do some good works, right? But everyone applying to law school has presumably gone to college. It's a prerequisite, right? And so everyone's had a professor where they could have had that sort of experience, that light bulb moment as a result of some sort of mentoring relationship.
Exactly.
Now, I got a question here from the chat that's related to this. Isaiah is asking, would you recommend a more narrative-based personal statement or one that's more college experience? I'm guessing maybe Isaiah means academic in nature.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think, honestly, it's kind of finding a balance a little bit between the two. At the end of the day, a lot of admissions officers are reading a lot of applications and a lot of personal statements. And so to an extent, I think it really is important to kind of tell a narrative at the start at least and, be descriptive in those first few sentences in that first paragraph. I think that's really, really important to try to hook the reader in. And so I do think it can be helpful to kind of tell a story at least, at the beginning part of that personal statement. It should still be an academic letter, an academic essay. But I do think kind of telling a story, at least at the start, can be really beneficial.
Right. Thank you for that. Yeah, I feel like so many of the best statements I work on, it's when they start with that hook of a specific moment in time and then zooming out from there to provide some context. So I could imagine that this Haiti example, applicant spends time in Haiti doing some sort of relief work with a nonprofit, and then this applicant encounters bureaucracy and red tape and regulations and wants to go to law school to better learn to navigate those to further that sort of work.
Exactly. And that's kind of perfectly described the personal statement that I really enjoyed.
Awesome. Yeah, same here. So we've got a few questions here on a slightly different tack related to the transcript. Specifically, if an applicant, let's say they have a lower than desired undergraduate GPA, they want to know what is the role of a master's degree or other graduate level work? Because my understanding is that LSAC doesn't really calculate that in their GPA.
Yeah, so your understanding is 100% correct. So in terms of reporting purposes, with the LSAC and ultimately what schools are having to report, for rankings purposes, the undergraduate transcripts and the undergraduate GPA, that's what really matters in that regard. However, the caveat to that is GPA and LSAT are indicators of a student's ability to be academically successful, not only in law school, but also, down the line, the ability to pass the bar. And so those are measures that we're kind of looking for, or looking at to determine whether a student's going to be academically successful. And if a student has been out of school for a little while, let's say, they've had significant work experience, the student that they were at 19 as an undergrad is probably not the student that they're going to be, at 27 or 28, after going and getting the master's. So graduate degrees, we do review them. They are a factor. They are indicators of, the ability to be academically successful and of a student's, capabilities in the classroom. So we do review them. It is a holistic approach, so everything matters. But for reporting purposes, you're correct in that, the undergrad GPA is always going to have a certain level of importance.
What about the question of redoing or retaking some college classes to boost the GPA in classes that didn't go so well?
Yeah, so that's another good question. For the LSAC, they do calculate the GPA, and both of those, courses are going to be included. So, I know there's freshman forgiveness programs where, that D or whatever gets wiped off the transcript if you retake it and get an A down the line. Unfortunately, with LSAC, or unfortunately, I should say for the students with LSAC, they are calculating all those grades. So that course doesn't just go away.
Right. Understood. I've gotten a few questions lately as well as tonight in the chat about older applicants, and does it make sense for older applicants to go to law school, and how are they considered differently, if at all, than younger applicants?
Yeah. So as far as whether it makes sense to go to law school, I think it's completely dependent upon each individual and what their ultimate career aspirations are and what they, want to do. So I think it's a very individualized decision. If somebody wants to go to law school, regardless of age, they should, look into it and go to law school. As far as whether it's something that we consider, it's really, not. I would say, I think last year of our incoming class, about 2/3 took some time off between finishing undergrad and starting law school. So the majority of our students do take some time in between undergrad and law school. It can certainly be beneficial in terms of, helping with maturity, helping, you gain that professional experience, and, helping prepare for law school. But as far as, age, I think our oldest incoming student last year, I believe, was 53. And, our youngest was, I believe, 20. So it just, it really just depends. There's no right or wrong time necessarily to start law school.
Right. And I'm sure that can make for some very interesting classroom discussions with the wide range of experience that students have.
Absolutely. And, that's something, we have a diversity statement as part of our application that's optional. And I know a lot of schools do offer the ability to write diversity statements. And, I've read great diversity statements, from non-traditional students who are looking to switch careers. And certainly you're exactly right. We do look for a variety of perspectives in our incoming class. And so people with all different experiences can add to that diverse set of perspectives.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, the diversity statement. So as you said, as you indicated, it's not just about race or ethnicity. You also indicated age could be a basis for a diversity statement. What are some other areas for diversity statements that you see, and what are you looking to get out of a diversity statement?
Yeah, so, first thing as far as, what we're looking to get out of it is, and I always tell people this, please proofread it. We didn't talk about it in the personal statement, but the quality of, a student's writing is so important. A lot of times the diversity statement is a shorter optional statement, and sometimes students have a tendency to kind of breeze through it because it is shorter, but it is another chance for us to evaluate writing. As far as what we look for, diversity can be really anything. It's really what we're looking for is the perspective, the voice, what somebody is going to bring to our law school community. And so it can be anything that's helped shape that person's voice or that person's perspective. It could be related to ethnicity or gender or religion. It could be something more non-traditional, like, somebody who's had a lot of work experience. It could be somebody who served in the military, who's, lived in a bunch of different countries and met people from, a variety of different cultures. And so it can be literally anything. It's just kind of that voice and that perspective and how that student arrived at that voice.
Right. Wow. Thanks for shedding some light on that. I appreciate it. Let's see. We got so many good questions here in the chat. I don't know that we'll even get to all of them, but let's see. Oh, in the personal statement or diversity statement or somewhere in the written essays, should an applicant mention why they want to go to that school in particular?
Yeah. So it depends. And I know you're going to hear me say it depends a lot. And it's going to depend a lot on the school and what the prompt is. Definitely make sure that each student should make sure that they are reading the prompts for each question. For us, it doesn't have to be in the diversity statement, but part of our personal statement prompt is, why are you interested in Maryland Carey law? Which means, it doesn't mean that a student has to write 10 different personal statements. What it means is maybe a student has to change, 2 or 3 sentences for that personal statement to kind of tailor a little bit to that individual school. But for us, it is something that we look for in terms of, has this student considered our law school?
Right, of course. And I think you want to indicate somewhere in the application why you want to go to that law school in one of the written portions.
Exactly. If you're from, North Carolina and you're applying to, a school in California and you grew up in North Carolina and you went to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for college, that school in California is probably going to want to know, well, why are you interested in coming out to California?
And they want to know you're going to stick it out.
Exactly.
It's a big change.
Yep.
Now, on the question of the resume and the work experience, does work experience help? And this student, I think they have the motivation behind this. Like, they might choose to do work experience just to look better for law school, which is something I always caution folks against, not to make major decisions like that just to get a slight boost, or real or imagined, in chances. And so, what do you tell folks with regard to work experience, waiting a year after undergrad versus going directly?
Yeah. So I think it's completely contingent upon each individual applicant and what they want to do and whether they feel like they're ready for law school. I wouldn't recommend just working for the sake of working if you're ready and you want to start law school right now. That being said, I mentioned earlier, but a significant number of our students do take some time off. I think it can be really beneficial. Not only do you get kind of that real world, 9-to-5 job type experience, but you have the opportunity to save up money, you gain maturity. Maybe you have some more time to kind of study and prepare for the LSAT without having to study for other tests. So there are certainly benefits to that. With the resume, a student doesn't necessarily have to have legal experience. And in fact, that's really not something that we're necessarily looking for. We're just looking to see that somebody has been active and is doing something other than, sitting home and doing absolutely nothing.
Right, of course. Yeah, you definitely don't want to have big gaps or blank spots in the resume. Now, as for the nuances here, CV versus resume, what's the difference and which one is preferable?
Yeah, so CV is usually going to be a little bit longer. A lot of times, individuals who have worked for a little bit longer are going to have those CVs that kind of talk about all of their experience, publications, presentations, stuff like that. Every school is going to vary with their prompts and their requirements. For us, there's no set page limit or requirement for the resume. It can go on to more than one page. For most students, I would say 1 to 2 pages is usually sufficient. I know sometimes we'll have people who send over CVs that are 20 and 30 pages long. What I would encourage anybody to do is, if that's the case, you can certainly send that over for us, but you want to make sure that the stuff that's really important that you want the admissions committee to kind of take note of right away is going to be at the beginning of that CV or at the beginning of that resume. But for Maryland, and I can, speak personally for me, as far as reviewing files, I do think I prefer a little bit more versus less. I'd rather somebody not just cut the resume off at one page just for space requirements. If there's something that's, unique that they want to describe, I think going onto a second page is completely okay. I'd rather get a clear picture of that student than be left kind of wondering.
Right. But I would also imagine you don't want a lot of 20-page resumes from 20-year-olds.
Exactly. Yep.
Now, out of curiosity, how many applications do you review per cycle?
Oh, goodness. So I review a good number of applications. It always depends on the year, and it depends on kind of the volume that year. Definitely, north of 1,000 every year. So I do review a good number of applications.
That's a lot. And if the cycle is less than 1 year, of course, that's a significant number per day. At least like 5-10 a day on average, I would imagine, but they're probably chunked in some way.
Yeah. It always kind of varies on what's going on. And the way it works at Maryland too is, your application is seeing multiple sets of eyes as well. And that's the way I think it is at most schools. We have a holistic approach, but multiple people are going to be, reviewing the applications.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was speaking with a student earlier today, and she was having some trouble figuring out her personal statement topic. She turns out that she's done a lot of political advocacy on a pretty divisive topic. Mm-hmm. And she was concerned that if she wrote about this in her application, that admission officers who are on the other side of that debate might hold it against her. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that on the factor of having multiple eyes.
Yeah, so I think, having multiple eyes kind of, not only does it protect against, something being missed or something like that, but also it's multiple viewpoints being able to read that personal statement. And sometimes I think it's helpful for applicants to know that, because in general, the personal statement shouldn't be written for one specific audience, because you just don't know who's necessarily going to be reading your personal statement. It could be a faculty member, it could be somebody in the admissions office, it could be a current student. There's just a bunch of different people that could be potentially reading that personal statement that have all different views from all different backgrounds, and so generally I do think it kind of helps insulate and helps that personal statement kind of be evaluated by just multiple people with different viewpoints.
Right. And I would imagine that you're not looking to evaluate it with an eye towards like having an interest in what this person wants to do. It's more about, do they have the ability to make it through law school and succeed? Exactly.
It's, do I get a clear sense as to why this person wants to go to law school, as to, who they are, and, does this person have the ability to succeed? Is their writing clear? Is it concise? I practiced for several years in DC before I started working in admissions, and being able to write is very, very important, and that's always going to kind of be the paramount thing in that personal statement.
Right. Thank you for that. So let's see, other parts of the application, the letters of recommendation. Let's talk a little bit about that. Mm-hmm. How many are you looking to get, and is it okay to have none that are from professors or only from professors?
Yeah. So it's going to, again, I'm going to hear me say it repeatedly, but it's going to depend on the school.
It's the same thing lawyers say, right? It depends.
Yep. It's something to get used to saying, because I imagine everybody listening to this webinar is going to say it multiple times throughout their career. But yeah, so letters of recommendation at Maryland, we require 2. You can submit up to 4. What I would say is quality is usually what rules out. So, don't necessarily just submit 4 for the sake of submitting 4. If there's 2 people who you feel are going to write you very, very good letters of recommendation, then that's usually sufficient. We do not require an academic letter. However, if somebody is still in undergrad or recently graduated, like it's a year out, I do think an academic letter can be beneficial. Now, again, that's something where every school really is going to vary. There are some schools that do require academic letters. For us, the most important thing is, how well does this person know you? Are they going to be able to write you a strong letter about your academic capabilities or your professional capabilities? But the deciding factor, I think, in terms of who students should ask to be, what can this person say about me, and are they going to be able to, provide me a strong and detailed letter?
Right, of course. And so avoiding the famous people with the big names in favor of those you actually know personally.
Exactly. I think that's always the route to go. It's nice to have a letter from, your local congressman, but if that congressman has met you one time, it's probably better to just ask the, campaign manager or, the chief of staff or whoever it is who knows you a little bit better.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So with regard to rolling admissions, we have a question on this again. When do you get back to students during this cycle?
Yeah, so again, it's going to depend on each school. For us, it's usually around 6 weeks or so. But that time can certainly be shorter. It can certainly be longer. It just depends on the cycle and the flow of applications more than anything else.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And does it tend to, the decision-making process, does that tend to get longer as you get later into the cycle? So 6 weeks at the beginning and then more time as it goes on?
I would say it can be a little bit longer sometimes in, later January, February, March. That time period can certainly be a little bit longer than other times just because that's usually when there's a significant heavy flow of applications. Whereas, September, October, November, there's certainly applications, but they don't come in quite as much as they do kind of right after the new year. And particularly with the changes in the LSAT and the changes in the timing, it's a little bit different of a year this year because there's not necessarily those data points that match to the exact same data points, last year. But there were a significant number of students who took that November LSAT. And so I do expect a lot of applications in January.
Right. We've got some Maryland-specific questions here, if you don't mind diving into those.
Sure, absolutely.
All right. So does Maryland Carey law allow students to defer admission?
Yeah. So it depends. I know I'm just repeating myself over and over again, but it depends. We do accept requests for deferral, and it always depends on space depends on space more than anything else. But I would say more often than not, we do grant deferrals.
Okay, that's good to hear. And then what about reapplying if someone gets denied or doesn't get the scholarship money they're looking for and they want to reapply?
Students can absolutely reapply. We have reapplicants every year who, maybe they didn't get in last year and then they get in this year, or maybe they got in but didn't get the scholarship they wanted and then this year they'll get more scholarship. It's a really, really individualized question. What I would encourage the students to do who are interested in reapplying is call the admissions office of whichever school you want to reapply to. Mention that you're a reapplicant. Ask them if they have time to kind of speak with you about the application and kind of go over what maybe can change or what would be beneficial for that student for the new cycle.
That's nice. So you're willing to have those conversations and give them like specific pointers on what they might need to change.
Absolutely. I think sometimes students think that, admissions offices aren't going to answer them, but that's what we're here for. We want to make sure that student has all the information they need in order to succeed and in order to make the best decision for themselves. So absolutely. And look, the worst that happens is the school says, no, we can't discuss that with you. That's literally the worst thing that could come of that.
Right. No, that's pretty cool. Now, if someone's reapplying, I've heard from a couple of other admission officers that they typically want applicants to write a new personal statement. Is that something you're looking for as well, typically?
So it really depends. I do think, I think it can be helpful sometimes, but if somebody wrote a really great personal statement, they don't necessarily have to write a new one. I mean, it really depends. Maybe it's somebody who applied in May and there wasn't space available anymore. And so applying in, September, October, puts that student in a better spot. So I don't think it's a necessity. But again, that's one of those where I recommend speaking to admissions and talking a little bit about the personal statement.
Right. They can get that personal feedback if they contact the office. All right. Let's see other questions here. Someone's asking about percentage of first year dropouts at Maryland Carey.
Yeah, so it's pretty much zero. We have very, very few. I think we've had, I want to say like one or two over the last several years. So it's not something that's particularly common.
Wow, yeah, that's negligible. That's like nothing.
Yep.
That's good. That's good to hear. Okay, let's talk a little bit about part-time versus full-time. Is there any difference in terms of numbers that are required for each program? Does Maryland Carey offer a part-time program?
We do offer a part-time program. So big differences between part-time and full-time. So most full-time programs are going to be 3 years. Most part-time programs are going to be 4 years, and that includes Maryland. The 4-year program, the part-time program classes for us are in the evenings from about 6:30 to 8:30 or 6:30 to 9:30 in the evening. They're designed that way because we have a lot of students, due to our proximity to DC, we have a lot of students who work for the government, who work in DC, and they'll take a train up to Baltimore called the MARC train. It takes about 45 minutes or so, and then come to class. And so it lets students in the part-time program be able to work full-time and not have to worry about rushing to school to get to a class that starts at 5:30. So they're designed for students who are working full-time during the day. But we have flexible scheduling between those two programs. So just because a student's in the full-time program and is taking classes during the day, they can still take classes that meet in the evening. And same thing vice versa. If the student is a part-time student and there's an elective that they really want to take that meets during the day, they have that flexibility to take a course that meets during the day. It just always depends on that student's work schedule and their flexibility.
Nice. So there's a lot of flexibility there if you can take classes across the different programs.
Yep.
Could you speak a little bit about the different clinics and opportunities at Maryland Law specifically?
Absolutely. So our clinical law program is perennially one of the top clinical law programs in the country. One of the things that's unique about our clinical law program at Maryland is every student who starts at Maryland Carey Law as a full-time student is required to do a clinic. So it's something that's really important to us. Our clinics are pro bono. They're helping individuals who can't afford an attorney or don't have access to an attorney. And one of the unique things is there's a law in Maryland that lets students practice on their professor's license. So in our clinics, our students will be handling real cases and real clients. In a given year, usually we have around 17 to 20 different clinics. So there's clinics in pretty much every area of law that a student may be interested in. There's clinics like our public health clinic that are a little bit more policy based, and so maybe a student who has no desire to ever step foot in a courtroom and no desire to do any litigation based work does a clinic like that. There's also clinics like our criminal defense clinic where you'll have the opportunity, or a student will have the opportunity to represent individuals in misdemeanor cases in Baltimore. So that's something that's kind of unique as well, in that you'll get that real practical experience. You'll be the one in court representing a client. The professor is making sure you're okay. They're there with you, but it's a student who's primarily responsible.
Very cool. I love that they can practice under the professor's license. Is that fairly uncommon?
I think a lot of states have provisions that give students those opportunities to kind of get that practical, hands-on experience. I mean, it's definitely something that we focus on at Maryland, is that experience-based learning model. It's really important for students to get outside the classroom and get that experience, because I think a lot of times that's the best way to figure out what exactly somebody wants to do. But I do think there are a number of states that have provisions in place where students can practice on their professor's license, but it always just depends on the availability of clinics, how many clinics are offered, stuff like that.
Well, it's nice that you have such a robust program in that, and I will imagine that with the proximity to DC, as you mentioned, there are a lot of opportunities there as well. Do you have a lot of students doing summer associateships on Capitol Hill and things of that nature?
Yeah, we do. So we do have a significant number of students who work in DC. And I can tell you anecdotally, back when I was in law school, I worked at a firm in DC during my third year of law school and took the train down and back. It's really easy to take advantage of stuff like that. We have a specific congressional and legislative externship program for students who are interested in working on Capitol Hill and doing, policy or working in politics. We've had students do externships at most federal agencies. So there's a lot of those opportunities depending on area of interest.
What about some of the electives at Maryland Carey Law? Could you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, so the way our curriculum works is for full-time students, first year is pretty much set. Students get one elective. And then after first year, students are free to really take whatever courses they'd like. We do have, several specialty programs where students can choose to concentrate in a specific area. But the nice thing with those, specialty programs, in addition to, the fact that students don't have to really apply for them, is that you can pursue a specialty and still be able to take other electives. So, even if you're pursuing, let's say a student wants to pursue a concentration in health law or environmental law or business law, usually those concentrations are only going to be, are only going to require about 18 credits or so. And a student's going to have, more than double that in terms of the amount of credits they can take as far as electives.
So there's a lot of flexibility there once again in terms of what the curriculum ends up looking like.
Exactly. And I think for students who know or have a really good idea as to something they're interested in, I encourage them, some schools will say they specialize, some schools don't specialize in anything. It really varies with each school. What I always encourage students to do is, go onto the websites and open up the course catalog. And if there's an area that you're interested in, make sure that there's a significant number of courses that are offered in that specific area.
Right. That's a great idea. See what the current students actually have access to.
Exactly.
Nice. I love that. So we got some questions on scholarships and financial aid.
Sure.
So I'm wondering if you could just speak generally first about what are the qualities of an application that is most likely to get merit scholarships?
Yeah. So for merit-based scholarships, so kind of first thing is students are eligible for merit-based scholarships simply by submitting their application. There's nothing additional that needs to be submitted other than the application. In order to for a student to put themselves in the best position for a scholarship, numbers become a little bit more important. So being able to reach or exceed a median in either GPA or LSAT can be really, really beneficial in terms of scholarship. So that's kind of the first thing. It is a holistic approach. The whole application is being considered for scholarship purposes, but I do think that GPA and LSAT takes on a little bit more importance there.
Yeah, that's the same thing I'm always telling folks. And of course, the GPA is fairly fixed by this point, most likely. So that LSAT score, it's worth retaking. Just a couple points more can make a huge difference.
Exactly. I mean, the difference in 3, 4, 5 points on the LSAT can be a significant monetary difference.
Yeah. So does that, I typically tell folks that it's worth applying a little bit later if they can get that LSAT up a couple more points, just because of that difference in what it can mean for scholarships or getting into a better ranked law school.
Absolutely. I think that's great advice. And I think, to an extent, I would say it is a little bit school specific, and that some schools have a little bit earlier deadlines, and it's a little bit score specific too. So I encourage students to, again, I know I'm just going to leave myself to getting more calls here, but I would encourage students to call the law school and talk to the admissions representatives about, where they stand and whether it makes sense to apply now or to wait till the student gets a new score. And the other thing that a lot of times students don't realize is that, for us at least, the application isn't necessarily done when it's submitted. There's always that ability to supplement the application. We have students every year who, receive a decision, supplement the application with a new score, and then get a different decision, or receive a scholarship, supplement the application with a new LSAT score, and maybe that scholarship amount changes. And so the application isn't done unless the student wants it to necessarily be done.
And on that note, I would love to talk a little bit about letters of continued interest. Should an applicant be waitlisted? So could you speak a little bit about what leads an applicant to being waitlisted in the first place, and then when it might be appropriate for them to follow up?
Yeah, absolutely. So, waitlist, again, every school is going to vary with how big the waitlist is. And you can certainly email, call, and inquire about waitlists at each individual school. Some schools will rank their preference or rank students on the waitlist. And so you'll get a number. Others, schools will just kind of review everybody, and there's no priority or anything like that necessarily. But waitlist is usually when the school just doesn't have enough spots at that time to be able to offer you a place in the incoming class. With letters of continued interest and with waitlists in general, I always think it's great to follow up. Usually I would say once a month or so is pretty good. And, it doesn't mean that a student has to write 3 or 4 letters of continued interest. Sometimes it can just be sending a quick email, making a quick phone call, just letting the school know that you're still interested, and that if you're offered a spot, it's something that you still, that you'd still be able to accept. With letters of continued interest, the big thing that a student should emphasize is, why they're interested in that specific school and what makes them, a good fit, and why they would be an asset to that program.
And I would imagine any updates as well, if something noteworthy happened that could strengthen the application.
Exactly. Any updated, LSAT scores, any updated transcripts, a new letter of recommendation, all that stuff can be beneficial. The caveat to that, I would say, is, if a student applied and had a certain GPA, and then the last year in college that GPA went down, maybe you don't want to send new grades that that aren't necessarily as positive as the previous ones.
Right, for sure. That definitely wouldn't help. Does any of this differ for part-time applicants with regard to the scholarship money or how to handle the wait list?
No, so for us it doesn't, and in part that's because there is such flexibility and between the programs, and there is ability to kind of maneuver around. In that, part-time students aren't taking classes only with part-time students, and full-time students aren't only taking classes with full-time students. So there isn't really a difference in terms of the review and in terms of the waitlist process.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah, it's something folks with part-time are always thinking it's going to be different in some way and wondering about that. So thanks for clarifying that. Binding decision programs, got a question about those. Do you offer one of those? And is the January LSAT too late for that program?
Yeah, so we do offer a binding decision program. There are a couple requirements for that. The biggest ones being that it's only available to Maryland residents or to individuals who graduated from a college or university in the state of Maryland. So it is a little bit restrictive in that sense. The January LSAT will be too late for the binding program. Our last deadline for the binding program is, I believe it's January 4th. So it'll be a little bit too late for that. With any binding program, I always encourage students to make sure that it is 100% where they want to go to school, and to make sure they know the financial ramifications of that binding program. Does it come with a scholarship attached? Or if it doesn't necessarily come with a scholarship attached, the student needs to make sure that they're comfortable of going to that school, whether they get $30,000 or whether they get $0.
Right. Oh, that's good to hear. Well, I think we've hit some of the biggest questions in the chat for tonight, but I would imagine that folks could follow up with you with any of the more nuanced ones, assuming they don't pester you too much.
No, absolutely. That's what we're here for. We're here to help. There's no pestering at all.
Awesome, Jonathan. Well, I really appreciate your taking the time. Do you want to just share with folks the best way to get in touch with you and to find out more about Maryland Carey Law?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, check out our website. That's a great way to find information. We have links on our website for, upcoming events, upcoming, webinars. You can come sit in our class, take a tour. Those are all things that we can arrange for students. For me personally, my email address is jglick, and that's the letter J, and then my last name Glick, Glick, @law.umaryland.edu. And our main admissions email is just admissions@law.umaryland.edu. So you can email either one of those, and we're always happy to help in any way that we can.
Awesome, Jonathan. Well, I really appreciate your taking the time and sharing your knowledge with everyone here, and folks who are interested in finding out more about my LSAT preparation or law school admissions help can contact me personally through the LSAT blog or the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. Well, anyway, Jonathan, thanks again for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it as well. And I hope everybody has a great evening.